Marcus Aurelius will mention God, but he's not talking about God in quite the same way. And I know you have a Catholic background, and it sounds like you're more convinced by the Stoic version of it. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear how you make sense of that.
Yeah, I'm more convinced by the Stoic version. It's quite similar to Christianity in many ways, which is to be virtuous. It is to be kind. It is to be a community. It's possible to incorporate some elements of Christianity, some elements of Stoicism when you're looking at how to live a better life.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we seek out conversations with people who believe in God and people who don't quite believe, but who still sense there's a worthy conversation to be had about life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
In a world where we're always on the hunt for wisdom on how to live, I wonder if you've come across Stoicism. Now, this is an ancient Greek philosophy that's experienced a resurgence in various quarters, including in Silicon Valley. And in Australia, the journalist Brigid Delaney has put it on the agenda in recent years. And as you heard her just say, there's some possibility of crossover, a kind of crossover between Stoicism and Christianity, Justine.
Yeah, the two philosophies, I guess, do align in various ways, enough so that this 2nd century Christian writer Tertullian claimed Seneca, one of the Roman Stoics, as an honorary Christian. He used to say that Seneca was one of our own, or often our own, in his words. And this is probably the reason why someone decided to forge a bunch of correspondence between the Apostle Paul and Seneca. The two were contemporaries of each other, but as far as we can tell, didn't know of each other's existence and never wrote to each other.
Yeah, well, it would be fascinating to imagine that
that's
situation,
right.
wouldn't it? So there's some crossover, but also, Justine, some significant differences between Stoicism and Christianity. So we wanted to tease those out here today, but not in a kind of conflict-driven way that pits our two guests or their positions against each other. We're not here for that kind of debate, but to make sense of the differences between the two. So we've got Brigid Delaney speaking about Stoicism.
Yes, I love Brigid's work. We've had her on the podcast previously talking about wellness culture, and now she's going to be talking about Stoicism. She's written 2 books on Stoicism. The first one was Reasons Not to Worry, How to Be Stoic in Chaotic Times, back in 2022.
Chaotic times then.
Well, chaotic times now as well, turns out. And more recently, The Seeker and the Sage, a Stoic conversation to hold you together in a fractured world, published late in 2025. That later book is more kind of like a fictionalized conversation that gets across the Stoic material, but in a creative way. So that's quite fun to read. Brigid's a serious seeker. She really cares about authenticity and really trying to get to the root of things. So I really wanted to hear her talk about Stoicism. I did also feel that we needed to hear from an expert on the classical world, on Greek philosophy, especially because, the last time I worked on a thing to do with Stoicism, I got some detail wrong. And so it's more for my benefit than it is for anyone else. And so this is where Professor Louis Marcos comes in. He's a Christian professor who holds the Robert H. Ray Chair in Humanities at Houston Christian University. And he's the author of many books that show his passion for ancient philosophy as well as Christian thought. I'm just going to give you a selection to give you a vibe because he's written several books. He's written From Achilles to Christ, Why Christians Should Read the Pagan Classics. There's also From Plato to Christ, How Platonic Thought Shaped the Christian Faith. Then also From Aristotle to Christ, How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith.
You've got a series, of course, there.
Yes, that's right. And he's on the record as saying that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, he would no longer be a Christian. He'd actually become Stoic instead.
It's intriguing, isn't it? We'll hear more from Lou Marcos in the second half of the podcast. Stay tuned for that. But here's Justine's interview with Brigid Delaney.
Brigid, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Justine.
The first book that you wrote on Stoicism was called Reasons Not to Worry. And I'm curious, are you a worrier by nature?
I think we all have things that we worry about. I don't think I'm an excessive worrier, but I come from a family where there's been a worrying parent or things like that. So In some respects, I rebelled against worrying and became very easygoing, maybe to my peril, and then corrected and became a bit more worried about things, but then found many reasons to worry. So Stoicism's been great in terms of just giving me a bit of perspective about what I can and can't worry about.
We will get into that shortly.
Mm-hmm.
But before we do, would you tick Stoic on the census if it was an option? Is that the nature of your, I guess, commitment to it? Or is it more like a set of principles that sits there in your life and it's a good toolbox, but it's not something that you're basing everything around? Like, how do you think of it?
Yeah, I don't self-identify as a Stoic purely because I see myself as a learner. I see myself as being very much in the world, the human world of making mistakes, of having bad habits, of old behaviours that aren't necessarily useful. And then I go to Stoicism to bring me back. But I'm not naturally a Stoic person, and that's capital S Stoic. I came to it fairly late, so I came to it in about 2018. And I find it very, very helpful, but I certainly have lots of behaviours and thought patterns that aren't Stoic.
Yeah, well, I'd like you to expand on that if that's okay. When you say that you're not a capital S Stoic person, like what is that person? What are they like?
I think a lot of people would struggle to identify themselves as capital S Stoic because a lot of people who follow the Stoic philosophy are constantly trying to attain something that often seems a little bit beyond reach. So the equivalent of a saint in Stoicism is the Stoic sage, which I write about in my book, The Seeker and the Sage. And there's probably no Stoic alive today who identifies as a sage. And a lot of the Roman Stoics that I base my work on, they are in a constant state of trying to improve, of trying to be more Stoic. And it's always a little bit further in the distance. So it's an ideal rather than an actuality. But when you try for the ideal, you actually end up becoming a better version of yourself.
Justine here, just breaking in. Here's Lewis Marcos explaining the 3 most prominent Stoics. Also, because of my interviewer error, I didn't ask Brigid to explain who they were.
3 of the most famous Stoics come from the Roman period. There is Epictetus, who was actually Greek, but he's living in the Roman period, and he had been a slave who bought his freedom. Then there was Seneca, who was actually the tutor to Nero. And the most famous Stoic of all was Marcus Aurelius, a 2nd century Roman emperor, the most powerful person of his day. As he was in what today is Germany, that was the very border hinterland of the Roman Empire, fighting against the German barbarians, trying to hold the empire together, he started writing down what is called the Meditations. And he thought out loud about what it means to be human, what it means to be part of a community. And although it sounds like I'm being silly, Justine, I'm not in saying that if Marcus Aurelius lived today, he would have written a blog, because that's exactly what it reads like when you read the Meditations.
Back to Brigid to get a sense of what ideals the Stoics were reaching for.
If you read Meditations, you'll see Marcus Aurelius is really trying to not be angry. And he talks about, well, what's an ideal man? An ideal man is someone who's gentle, someone who's kind, someone who's not prone to anger, who has his emotions under control. And the way he writes about this, you can see that maybe in the course of the day, he struggled with his anger. So he goes back to his chambers at night where he writes his journal, and he's reflecting on what's the Stoic ideal when it comes to anger. It's about learning to live cooperatively and peacefully with one another. So he's using Stoicism to remind himself each night in his journal about how he should live. But we don't really have a record of, was he that day incredibly angry? Did he lose his temper out on the battlefield, speaking to his generals, his children? We don't know, but it's written in such a way that it seems to be reminding himself of Stoic ideals. And it's hard to get concrete proof, but I have definitely become a lot less angry since I started practicing Stoicism. It just takes a lot more to get me wound up.
Yeah.
And I think that is, like when you write, I've written 2 books on Stoicism, so I've spent many years now kind of in a daily practice with it. And it has seeped in and changed my emotions. So in one of the big ways is anger. If I'm flying somewhere and then suddenly there's a problem with the plane, or I just missed my boarding time and I can't get on the flight, there's no way I would lose my temper or have a confrontation or raise my voice.
And you might have at one point?
Yeah, if I'm stressed, I might have. I might have been frustrated and shown that frustration.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really hard to provoke me now. And I think that's as a direct result of practicing Stoicism. I meditate twice a day, which I think when we spoke about Wellmania a few years ago, I was doing that. So the meditation kind of feeds into the Stoicism insofar as it slows me down. So I'm less likely to get angry if I've got that sort of mental space.
Tell me about what you call the control test.
Yeah, it's I call it the control test because it's basically looking at what you can and can't control, in a Stoic lens. Epictetus, one of the Roman Stoics, called it the dichotomy of control in his book, The Enchiridion, which were notes a student took from his lectures. So he didn't actually write them, but they were lecture notes that have been saved through the centuries. And he set up this control test in The Enchiridion, which essentially says you only have control over very few things. I interpret this test as being you have control over your character, your actions and reactions, and how you treat others, which is a form of action. So everything else is outside of your control. There are some things you can sort of influence or try and influence, such as your health or vocation or your work. But essentially, you don't have full control over those things.
I'd like to hear more about negative visualization. That's certainly something that Stoics are big on.
Yeah, definitely. So we don't have control over life and death. You don't know when you're going to die. You don't have full control over your health. So the Stoics had this practice, which I do when I, get a test result or something. I'm at the doctor. I imagine it's like the worst case scenario, just briefly, so I don't get too anxious. And then I map out how that might look, I might have to take 6 months off work and have treatment, or I might die. And you have a little taste of that, and then you go into the doctor, and if the doctor says, yes, you have cancer, you've done a bit of a rehearsal in your mind, and you've seen that that's possible for you, and you've mapped out how that might look. If the doctor says, your results are great, you're so healthy, there's a feeling of gratitude that you haven't got that disease. So the Stoics did it in some pretty hardcore circumstances. So Epictetus used to talk about when you tuck your child in to sleep at night to imagine the child doesn't wake up. And I think there is a Christian prayer very similar.
Yeah, you mentioned this in your book. Something, if the
Now I
Lord,
lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take.
Right.
So a similar thing, but without the Lord aspects in Stoicism, which is this might be the last time I see my child. They might die in the night. Obviously, back then, there's a lot more infant mortality, and that was something that people had to prepare for. But, it is a way of having gratitude when the worst doesn't happen, but also being able to accept when things go wrong. You've had a rational run through, and you realise that if something bad happens, well, why shouldn't it happen to you? Just as it could happen to anyone else.
So is it kind of like a prepare for the worst, hope for the best?
They weren't really into hope. So
yeah, tell me more about that. What's going on there?
Well, hope for the best, it's outside your control. Say we go back to the analogy of getting a cancer result.
Yeah.
You might hope that you don't have cancer, but you don't have control over whether or not you have it. So hope is a futile emotion in the Stoic world. You have to deal with reality. So they would use the term prefer.
Okay.
You prefer not to have it, but you essentially, there's a whole kind of element of theory in Stoicism called preferred indifference, and health falls under that. So you should prefer to be healthy, but because it's outside your control, you should be indifferent.
Got it.
The same goes for money. Comes and goes, you often don't have control over money, and reputation. So what other people say about you is often outside your control.
Yeah.
So hope is not a useful concept in Stoicism. So a lot of Stoicism is about maintaining a steady state of equilibrium, of not going too high, not going too low. So they looked at events that really rock us, and they have these theories that are around not being too devastated when the worst happens, but also realizing if something great happens, that too will pass. You can't hang on to it. So the whole aim of this is to suffer less, and a lot of the Stoics thought you suffered less if you were more even-tempered.
Now, I recall an exchange in The Seeker and the Sage where, you know, your main character, a journalist, is speaking to like a Stoic expert, and social media comes up, and the journalist figure is talking about experiencing some kind of online pile-on, maybe just because you're a woman or because you're a journalist and you have an opinion online. And the sage figure is kind of like, well, don't worry about that. It's out of your control. But I'm curious because I know that you care about social justice. Like, and you mention in that, the journalist character mentions toxic masculinity is a thing, and you can kind of maintain your equilibrium and not get upset about that. But it seems to me that in doing so, you might be just going, okay, there's injustice out there. I can't control it. I'm just going to try and do my best. Like, does that put the onus on the victim, in inverted commas, to sort of deal with the external oppression? Like, how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, The Seeker and the Sage is essentially a long dialogue trying to deal with that question, which is how do you create change in a world where you have so little control? That's a question I've been wrestling with since I became interested in Stoicism 8 years ago now. So what the Stoics say and how I've interpreted what they say is you should try and improve the world, definitely. And you should do what you can and follow your ideals. However, you also have to be prepared to lose, to not be able to shift things or not be able to shift things this time, or just to shift things in a very small way.
Yeah.
And to not be too devastated if you don't get the outcome you want. Doesn't mean you don't try, but they're all about, in the Roman days, rhetoric was taught alongside Stoic philosophy. You have to be able to persuade people, convince them to do what you want to do, but you can't be so attached to the outcome that you fall apart if the rhetoric doesn't work. Stoicism's, I think, a great tool for politicians. And
you've worked closely with them recently.
Closely with them, yeah. And it's suited to people in public life who might be pushing for something, policy change or going for election or re-election, where it's really out of your control whether or not you're elected, whether or not your policy gets through cabinet or whatever. You need to be able to recover from the losses quite quickly while still maintaining your North Star or your principles. So Stoicism allows you to recover quickly from defeats and keep going.
Tell me about the classical virtues. How do they help you to recover quickly? Not that I think that the ancient Greeks were constructing these virtues so you can recover quickly, but they are saying that these are the key to the good life. Is that right?
Yeah. Recovering quickly is important because it goes back to equilibrium, the ataraxia that the Greeks and the Romans talk about. You need to be able to be not knocked out by stuff. You need to be able to get back up quickly. Seneca, one of the Roman Stoics, wrote this fantastic letter to one of his friends, Marcia, who was mourning the death of her son. I think he'd been dead 7 years, and she couldn't recover. She was just so grief-stricken. So his letter to her is all about, like, yes, grief is important and it's natural. However, there should be a bit of a limit on how devastated you are because you're not useful to the other family members. Your life is passing you by. I mean, it goes back to this thing of wanting to limit suffering. The first suffering is the death of the son. That's unavoidable. That's happened. The second suffering is the prolonged grief. And that, Seneca says, is avoidable. So the virtues are, there's 4 of them: courage, wisdom, justice, and moderation. So courage, I think, going back to the doctor's surgery analogy, to face what awful news might be awaiting you. Courage to face the unknown in any situation where you don't have full control. Wisdom to know that it's going to be okay no matter what happens, you'll be all right. Moderation was interesting. That was around food and drink. And it's essentially, they're saying that your rational mind is so important that you shouldn't compromise it by drinking excessively or stuffing yourself with rich food. Like, you need to have a sharp mind. And moderation as well as that is emotional moderation, not going too high, not going too low. And justice, I think, justice to me has always been my favourite Stoic virtue because it's the answer to that social justice question that you were asking earlier, which is, where does social justice fit into Stoicism? It doesn't seem to have a place in the control test, But then if you look at the virtues, justice is one of the 4. So it's in there. It's very important. It just has you have to take almost a sideways approach and try and get justice, even though you mightn't be able to control the outcome.
Now, you mentioned grief and that letter that Seneca wrote to that lady. I'm curious to hear from you where Stoicism kind of breaks for you. For example, Christianity for me breaks not beyond repair, but kind of fractures a little bit at the problem of evil, right? Like there are answers to that, but it's hard to read them and feel fully satisfied, I suppose, with the response. When you read Seneca talking about grief, or like Epictetus talking about grief, I mean, there's a very unfortunate fragment that survived where he compares like, you know, the breaking of your favorite coffee mug to like the death of your child or your wife. It's like, oh well, that's happened. Like, I don't think he was
irreplaceable.
I don't think he was as flippant about that. But like,
and often some of it's translation. You know,
right.
like it's but it is he is explaining a principle, and I don't agree with it either. That he says you lose one friend, you just pick up another one. Like, but I think he's trying to remind us that we're all essentially,
right.
we're all unique, but we also die, and if you lose a friend, another friend comes along. So they may not be the same type of person, but they can fulfill a similar role. It's uncomfortable to hear. Where does it break? I find desire a really tough one. They say that desire is within your control, and I think there's been a lot. Like, these guys were coming up with this stuff 2,000 years ago or more, and there's a lot we know now about the unconscious, neuroscience, all sorts of things that create desire. Hormones is another one. And to assert that the rational mind has primacy over bodily kind of aspects, I don't think's right. But look, they got most things right. Grief, I've had a number of friends who've read the book after they've lost someone, and they weren't quite offended, but they were almost offended by how not flippant the Stoics were, but they were quite matter of fact, and they did say that after a few months of grieving, you should move on with your life. And that didn't accord with their experience of grief, which is really very profound. What really surprised me about the reception to Reasons Not to Worry was how many people read it who were grieving or who were dying, which was really interesting and very humbling for me, because I'm not a particular expert on any of those things. Feedback I got from family members of people who'd read it in their last stages of life was that it was comforting in a strange way. Because the Stoics are so matter of fact and because their emphasis is on suffering less. So they liked the fact that maybe their loved ones would cap their suffering. No one wants someone they love after they die to be immobile for a decade. So there are some appealing things with that. But I think the truth of it probably is a lot more embodied. So what I mean by that is I think grief lives in the body, and you can't just use your rational brain like the Stoics did to put a limit on it.
And a boundary.
Yeah, it's a much more kind of wild and strange and unusual process that people go through only maybe a few times in their life, and it can't necessarily be treated like other things.
You're listening to Life and Faith from CPX, and we're hearing about Stoicism in contemporary life with Brigid Delaney. In this second half of the show, we'll continue to hear from Brigid as she makes sense of Stoicism and what it can offer people in chaotic times. We'll also be hearing a little from Justine's chat with Professor Lou Marcos. But at this point in the interview, Justine, you asked Brigid about a theme or phrase that often crops up in Stoic writings, living in accordance with nature.
Yeah. So,
what does this mean?
For me, it means it's very similar to the Buddhist concept of dharma. So it's what our path is, So the Stoic concept of nature has multiple meanings. So there's your nature, so your dharma. My nature, as is yours, I presume is to be a writer, to explain things, to be engaged in ideas. So my nature is to do work that involves that. Other people's natures might be carer or an astronaut, like it's doing what feels really good for you to do. Then there's living according to nature, which is looking at the natural world. Things like a flower, you plant something, it's like little, then it grows, then it's in full bloom, it weathers all sorts of things, and then it has its season to die. So it dies. And so Marcus Aurelius and others say, if you want to see how your life's going to go, you just look at nature. It has its seasons, as does human life. And then we are part of nature. So, there's this great Stoic concept of being returned, which is when you die, you are returned to nature. You become matter. You are something that is absorbed into the earth. You're essentially a collection of sort of minerals and cellular matter and all sorts of things that get reabsorbed.
This picture of the world is an intriguing one that, as you'll hear, reveals some key differences between Stoicism and Christianity. And also because Stoic writers will sometimes mention God, but they don't mean the same kind of God that Christians speak about. I asked Lou Marcos to fill in the gaps of my understanding. What did Greek philosophers think about ultimate reality? And how did Christianity challenge or change that picture of the world?
The Stoics believed in God, but he was kind of a more removed God. It wasn't a God who was intimately involved in your life that you could have a relationship. It wasn't that kind of a Christian God. But it was a belief that there was an order in the universe, that there was order and balance and beauty and harmony. And we want to come into sync with that. I'm going to say that the higher pagans, Plato, Aristotle, they recognized that there was order in the universe. They believed that there was order and purpose. And they often use that word logos or logos. That's the word that means word or speech or rationality. And there was an order that ordered the stuff in the world. And so they did not believe in complete randomness. Now, Aristotle, most famously, what he saw was what he called an unmoved mover, that there must be a force outside the world that gives order and motion and balance to everything else. It must move everything, but it must be itself unmoved. Now, where Christianity is different is we're saying that there is an order, but it's not just a divine mind. It is a divine personality that doesn't just start the clock and let it run on its own, doesn't just establish laws of nature and let them run on their own, but that the God revealed in the Bible is an active God who enters into the world, who speaks and wrestles with us and wants to be known. So the watchmaker is what's called deism, the belief that there is a divine order, but it's not personal and it doesn't get involved in our lives. But the God revealed in the Bible, it does miracles. Now, he follows the laws of nature, but he does get himself involved again and again and again.
In short, says Lou Marcos, ancient philosophy presumes an impersonal universe, Christianity a personal one.
For a lot of the higher pagans, like Plato or Aristotle, the highest goal was what they called the beatific vision. They believed that the ultimate life was a life of contemplation, and the beatific vision was contemplating the unmoved mover, or many people know Plato believed in the forms, the form of the good, that was the ultimate in life to do that. Okay, what is the difference between that and Christianity? Christianity also used the word beatific vision, but I am not contemplating just an abstract idea. I am contemplating a personal triune God who is love, right? So if God was absolutely one, like he is in Islam, then before he created the world, he couldn't have been love because there was nothing to love. But in Christianity, for all of eternity, the Father has loved the Son and the Son has loved the Father. And the love between Father and Son is so real, it is a person, the Holy Spirit. That's how C.S. Lewis explains it, but he's getting it from Augustine's book on the Trinity, that God is a dynamic community. So even before he created the world and created us, he was already in love in action. But out of love, he moved out of himself to create the world and to create us, but ultimately moved out of himself to become one of us.
And here, Lou gets to the guts of the differences between Stoicism and Christianity. Basically, that if Christianity is not true, then Stoics really have the best approach to life.
Christianity is unique because it says God came into the world and became a man. He didn't stand outside and watch. He actually came in and joined us. And it says that he conquered and defeated death in the resurrection. So Christianity rests upon the resurrection. If Jesus didn't raise from the dead and all we do is remember him, then basically, has God ever really spoken? I mean, we've got prophets and this and whatnot. But to me, if God is not that direct as he is in Christianity, even if he exists, he's removed, then I believe we're kind of on our own, okay? We can get advice from the Torah, from the Quran, from the intellects, from whatever you want, okay? But if God did not actually become a man and rise from the dead, then we're kind of on our own. And I believe that if we're on our own, I think we will lead the best life by controlling, not eliminating, but controlling our emotional reactions, facing things directly, analyzing them, and again, moderating ourselves. Here's what a Stoic does, Justine, okay? Instead of trying to force the world to conform itself to me and my desires and my passions and my lusts, I find a way within reason and without losing myself to conform my own actions to reality the way it really is. We all respect people when we see people that can just continue without losing their mind, right? They can stay calm and not yell at everybody and just move along smoothly through life. To me, that's the best option. I mean, if God hasn't really spoken, if he hasn't really conquered death, then the best thing we can do is learn to control ourselves and hopefully benefit society, be part of the group, be part of society, but also learn to protect yourself in a way that's not unhealthy.
Now, back to my interview with Brigid. Marcus Aurelius will mention God, but he's not talking about God in quite the same way. And I know you have a Catholic background, and it sounds like you're more convinced by the Stoic version of it. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear how you make sense of that.
Yeah, I'm more convinced by the Stoic version. I think the example of Jesus is a really powerful example of how to live. If we're unchecked, you just have to look at global politics at the moment. If we're unchecked, humans kind of rip each other apart. There's a savagery that has been untamed throughout time. And I think somewhere along the line, it was seen as extremely important to have a model or a role model, a virtuous model of how to live in a different way, a model of how to be, that's what Christianity is, how to be Christian. What does that mean? It means loving your neighbour. And the Stoics were huge on role models as well, but it was a model of how to be virtuous, how to live a better life. So that's how I see Jesus. And, in Stoicism, there's no afterlife. Like, once you're dead, you're dead. And their whole thing is, it's quite similar to Christianity in many ways, which is, it is to be virtuous, it is to be kind, it is to be a community. Marcus wrote, we are born to be part of one another, part of a community. We're not meant to be fighting. So, yeah, I think it's possible to incorporate some elements of Christianity, some elements of Stoicism when you're looking at how to live a better life.
You wrote an article a couple of months ago where you spoke about having gone to 2 funerals in quick succession. And one of them was a religious funeral and one was a secular funeral. And you mentioned how maybe in the religious funeral, the person wasn't really spoken about in great detail. They were depersonalized in some ways. But that the religious content, the stuff around death and hope within a religious framework felt more comforting than the secular funeral that you'd gone to. What's going on there with that? Are you being less stoic on that day when you have that reaction, or how do you kind of reconcile that?
I see that as a collectivist impulse that I have. And this is in contrast with Stoicism, which is very much, it's individualistic insofar as you can't really influence anyone. Like the Stoics never proselytized. They'd be appalled that I was doing a podcast. Like they really didn't want to influence or push Stoicism. Like they didn't want to push it on anyone. So it was a practice that you did individually and you never talked about it. But by your example, people might use you as a role model, and that's how you create change. To be part of a faith community, a church, it's actually comforting to have rituals around big things like death, birth, to have sacraments, to have markers, to have people with you on that journey from cradle to grave like you would in a parish. And I think that's what I meant in that piece, which is it is comforting to be dehumanized in a way because you're part of something greater than the individual. Whereas if you're only known for your worldly achievements, the achievements end when your life ends, or they end before your life ends. And what are you left with? So I think what Christianity does really well is it does community, it does ritual, it does things that make people feel less alone in the world. And that's what I think is missing in Stoicism, is the ritual aspect and the community aspect. And there are various groups that get together as Stoics to connect, but, I think there should be more of it.
Why is Stoicism so popular these days? Because it has experienced a resurgence in recent times, hasn't it? And I suppose in maybe both in Reasons Not to Worry and The Seeker and the Sage, there's references somewhere in the subtitle to chaotic times, quote unquote.
Chaotic times. I mean, I've been thinking about the chaotic times bit. It does feel chaotic at the moment, but Marcus Aurelius had this great thing in Meditations, which is, if you want to see the future, look back at the past. Empires rose and fell then, and they will now and on into time. So things are chaotic now, but then things have always been chaotic. But I think going through the pandemic, a lot of people realised that they didn't have anything to hang on to. Their normal routines were disrupted, their friendships were disrupted, their life was disrupted, they had a lot of time to think, and they needed a framework. And I think that's what Stoicism provides, as does Christianity, as does Buddhism. Stoicism is a cradle-to-grave thing where if you hook into it and it appeals to you, it can be there with you every step of the way. I mean, the ancient Greeks and Romans thought about all these markers that we have. They thought about, how do you deal with being sued? How do you deal with losing all your money? How do you deal with a serious illness? How do you deal with death of loved ones? How do you deal with your own death? It's all there, and it's still as relevant now as it was back then. And, that's appealing to a lot of people. Trying to work it out on your own is really hard. It is traditionally, I have found, a more masculine philosophy. There's a lot of male popular Stoic authors, and they have podcasts and YouTube stuff. And for men, Stoicism is a way of having some self-help without being too self-helpy. But I've loved introducing it to women as well and people outside that scene.
A lot of the stuff that you're saying makes a lot of sense, and it feels like, if there is no God, this is the way to live, right? You can't control anything, you can only control yourself, so just knuckle down and sort it out. But I suppose that, like you mentioned before, that there's a grief bit that doesn't quite fit right. There's a desire bit that you don't know how to quite sort out for yourself. It feels like Stoicism's cure for the human condition is to take the human bits out of it. If we could for a moment pretend that I'm a seeker and you're the Stoic sage, what would you say to that?
I'd say, I hope that you don't think that. I mean, you obviously do think that, but getting deeply into Stoicism, you see so much humour through it and so much joy. They're not trying to take the human bits out, but what they're trying to do is make the things that hurt not be too prolonged. So they're just wanting people to suffer less, and they look at suffering as in, can you mitigate this aspect of suffering by just injecting a bit of rationality? It's not saying don't grieve or never grieve or
no,
don't
I get
desire,
that. Yeah.
but it is saying you can lust after someone for 10 years and they're not interested in you, and you do at some point need to
face reality.
So you can find the person that does want to be with you. So I find them so wise, and they want the best for people.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are brilliant writers, but they're also extremely funny. Like, even though the stuff was written thousands of years ago, there's so much humour in there because they can look at how humans sort of, get caught up in things and tie ourselves in knots, and they can laugh at, how we do life. Seneca said this interesting thing, which is this doctrine has developed in this time, but, we're not fundamentalist about it. Like, we expect people to add on and change it as time goes on. They would be horrified if it was,
like a religion, you mean?
Frozen in amber rather, if it was static.
As I said, I think they make a lot of sense if it is a closed universe. But unless there is something that enters from outside, which I think is, because they talk about the logos, right, as the kind of rational order. Well, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is the Word made flesh, is the Logos made flesh. So it's like, this is a very different picture of the universe. This is a universe that is not just impersonal, but is personal and actually wants relationship. But I understand that you don't buy that. But I think that's where I'm with you up until that point, and then I'm like, actually, we part ways because I think I live in a different universe, so to speak, But yeah, no, I really see you as a fellow traveller in this, and I've really enjoyed your work in this area.
Thank you.
So
thank you, Justine.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
Thanks so much to Brigid Delaney, author of The Seeker and the Sage and Reasons Not to Worry. You can grab both at your local bookstore. Definitely worth a read. Always love her work. Also, big thanks to Lou Marcos for the philosophy lesson. His latest book is From Aristotle to Christ, How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith. I'll post some relevant links in the show notes, so be sure to chase them up.
Yes, and if you've enjoyed this conversation, pass it on to someone you think might like it too. Meanwhile, you could leave us a rating or review. It really helps others to discover our work. Thanks to our producer, Alan Douthwaite, and this time to Mark Hadley for some interview support as well. Next time.
She is a witness at every major moment of the Christian faith. It's not even questioned that she was at the cross when the body was laid in the tomb, that she was a witness of the sealed tomb and then of the empty tomb, but then also the first witness of the resurrection.